They say gold can't kill you, but for Marcus Licinius Crassus, it did in the most grotesque, humiliating way imaginable. His mouth was pried open, his jaw dislocated, and as his limbs were pinned down by foreign hands, molten gold was poured straight down his throat. Boiling liquid wealth seared through his insides, melting tissue, turning breath to fire, and silencing forever the richest man in Rome. But this wasn't just murder. This was a message, a punishment, a final vicious act of poetic irony. Crassus, banker to an empire hoarder, a fortune manipulator of men, had chased gold his entire life. And in death it chased him back. Why was he killed like this? What did he do to deserve such horror? Was it greed, arrogance, betrayal, or something darker still, the collapse of Roman power in the East, and a fatal ambition that crossed into madness? This isn't just a story of wealth or war. It's a descent into pride defeat and a death so brutal it became legend. Because before there was Caesar, before there was Nero, there was Crassus. And the way he died tells us everything about the ancient world, its cruelty, its power, and its merciless justice. You think you've heard brutal stories before? You haven't heard this one. This is the tale of Crassus the Roman, who died drinking gold. And this is history's most brutal death. Rome in the 1st century BCE was a furnace of ambition war and political chaos. The Republic, once a proud system of balance between Senate people and consul, was fracturing beneath the weight of its own expansion. And in that rising smoke and power vacuum stood 3 men, a triumvirate of ambition: Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was not born a man of nothing. He came from nobility, a patrician lineage with prestige, but not yet dominance. His father had served as consul, and the young Marcus learned early how power moved behind the scenes, not with swords, but with favors, money, and silence. What set Crassus apart wasn't just his lineage, it was his obsession. While Pompey won glory on the battlefield, and Caesar mastered rhetoric and popularity, Crassus became a master of wealth. And in Rome, money was power. He didn't just acquire wealth, he manipulated it. During the bloody civil war between Marius and Sulla, Crassus backed the winning side Sulla's and made a fortune off the ashes of Rome's chaos. He bought confiscated properties for pennies, sometimes even killing the former owners to take what was left. But it wasn't enough. It never was. Crassus invested in fire brigades, so not out of charity, but because he could wait until a building caught fire, then offer to buy it mid-blaze for a fraction of its worth. If the owner refused Crassus, let it burn. If they accepted, he saved it. He wasn't just rich, he was feared. Still, in a society where military success meant real political clout, Crassus lacked what his rivals had: legendary victories. So he bought influence instead. He funded Caesar's rise, paid debts, pulled strings. Behind every public figure was Crassus's gold. But behind the gold was something deeper: envy. Envy of Pompey's adoration, envy of Caesar's genius. He had everything, yet in Rome's brutal hierarchy he still felt like the third wheel. So when the opportunity arose to share power with his rivals, to form what history now calls the First Triumvirate, he took it. 3 men dividing Rome's future, like merchants splitting spoils. Crassus got Syria, a wealthy province at the empire's edge. But Syria wasn't just rich, it was a doorway to the east, to glory, to Parthia, the Parthian Empire. Rome's ancient rival was powerful, mysterious, and most importantly, unconquered. They had horses that moved like ghosts, and archers who never missed. They were the one enemy Rome had not broken, and Crassus, hungry for legacy, saw his chance. He would do what no Roman had done, march into Parthia, crush their armies, and return as a hero, not just rich, but immortal. The Senate warned him, so did augurs, even his soldiers whispered of omens and doom. But Crassus wouldn't listen. He had the money, the men, and the will. And in 53 BCE, he crossed the Euphrates with 40,000 troops into the unknown. What followed wasn't just a defeat. It was a disaster so total, so humiliating, that Rome would not forget it for generations. But at this point in the story, Crassus didn't know that. He saw only gold glory and the crown of a conqueror. He didn't see the trap. He didn't see the arrows. He didn't see death riding toward him in silence. Not yet. The sun beat down on the Mesopotamian plain, and the men in Roman armor felt it like punishment. They marched eastward, far from familiar lands, far from glory, following a man who had never commanded in foreign terrain. Crassus was no Caesar, no Alexander, and Parthia was not Gaul or Greece. It was a vast sunburned chessboard, and the Romans were already in check, though they didn't know it yet. Crassus believed he had a plan. He had arranged to ally with the local Armenian king, Artavasdes, who promised reinforcements and knowledge of the land. With Armenia's cavalry and terrain advantage, Crassus might have stood a chance. But when Artavasdes advised him to take a northern route through the mountains, one that would protect Roman forces from the open plains, Crassus dismissed it. He wanted speed. He wanted spectacle. He wanted victory served in days, not months. And there was a man who was more than happy to guide him to it. His name was Ariamnes, a local Arab chieftain, allied, or so it seemed, with Rome. He offered to lead Crassus's army through the desert, directly to where he claimed the Parthians were encamped. Crassus accepted without hesitation. But Ariamnes was a traitor, and what he led them into was not a battlefield. It was a trap. As they pressed forward, Parthian scouts watched every movement. Crassus's army, strung out and unfamiliar with the open plains, was exhausted and dehydrated. Still, Crassus pressed on. He wanted to strike first before the Parthians could rally. He believed the enemy would be ill-equipped, scattered, easily crushed by Roman discipline and steel. He was wrong. Waiting for him was Serena, not a king, but a Parthian general of rare brilliance. Charismatic, calculating, and cruel Serena had gathered around 10,000 cavalry, heavily armored cataphracts, and deadly horse archers. He knew he couldn't match Rome in hand-to-hand infantry combat, but he didn't need to. He had the desert, and he had time. When the two forces met near Carrhae, it was as if Rome had stepped into a storm of ghosts. Serena's archers never stopped. Their arrows came not in volleys, but in waves, endless, unrelenting. The sky darkened with their fury. Roman shields were built for close combat, not for an enemy who never approached. The legionaries stood in formation, raising their scuda, but it was like trying to shield themselves from rain with paper. Arrows pierced gaps, eyes, throats, groins. Screams broke through armor as men died where they stood unable to strike back. Crassus tried to advance. Serena retreated, drawing him deeper into the open. Each step forward was another layer of the trap tightening. Desperate, Crassus sent his son Publius young, brave, eager, with a cavalry force to outflank the Parthians. It was a fatal mistake. Serena let them come, then surrounded them. Publius fought with all the passion of a Roman bred for greatness, but his men were cut down one by one. The Parthian horsemen circled them like vultures, releasing arrows that curved mid-flight and struck targets even while galloping away. Roman tactics meant nothing against such mobility. Publius, knowing capture meant torture or worse, took his own life. His severed head was later brought to Crassus, not with a messenger, but on the tip of a spear. When the Roman soldiers saw it, morale broke. This wasn't war anymore. This was slaughter. Crassus, shaken, tried to retreat toward the city of Carrhae. Night fell, and thousands fled blindly into the desert. Many were never seen again. Others froze or died of thirst, lost in a foreign land with no landmarks and no mercy. At Carrhae, Crassus found brief shelter. But Serena didn't attack the walls. He waited. He surrounded, and then he offered a lie. He invited Crassus to parley, to negotiate safe passage back to Rome. Crassus hesitated. His officers begged him to refuse. But pride is a powerful poison. And Crassus, ruined but still clinging to the last shreds of dignity, agreed. They met under an open sky. The Parthians rode with gold and silk, smiling too easily. Crassus arrived flanked by officers trying to appear strong. They spoke in vague terms. A gesture was misunderstood or made to seem so, a scuffle, a shove, and suddenly swords were drawn. Crassus's escort was slaughtered on the spot. He was seized, bound, and dragged into the Parthian camp. Here history grows hazy. Roman sources contradict one another, and Parthian ones are sparse. But one account rises above the rest, a story so symbolic, so cruel, it feels like myth. They didn't behead him. They didn't crucify him. Instead, they forced him to the ground, tore open his mouth, and poured molten gold down his throat, not to kill him quickly, but to make a point, to make a lesson of the man who had worshipped wealth above all else. The screams were said to be brief, but unforgettable. Marcus Licinius Crassus, once the richest man in the known world, died in agony, not in the halls of Rome, but in the dust of a distant land, mocked by men who saw in him not a conqueror, but a fool. It was over. And yet for Rome, it was just the beginning of something darker. They say death reveals a man, but Crassus had already been unmade long before the gold ever touched his lips. When he was taken bound and humiliated into the Parthian camp, he was not Marcus Licinius Crassus, the consul of Rome, the financier of Caesar, the architect of empire. He was a man stripped to his core, desperate, beaten, broken. The silence that fell over the Roman survivors who watched from the walls of Carrhae was not the silence of discipline. It was despair. Serena had won. Not just the battle, the story, and he would write it in fire and spectacle. The execution wasn't hurried. The Parthians knew what they held in their hands, not just a Roman general, but a symbol of Roman arrogance. Serena wanted a performance. Word had already begun to spread east and west of Rome's humiliation. But a death like this, it would echo across empires. According to Roman historian Cassius Dio Crassus, was forced to kneel as the Parthians jeered, mocking his failed ambition. You wanted gold, they sneered. Take it now. Some say they filled his mouth with molten metal while he still lived. Restrained by ropes, his face held skyward, the liquid gold hissing as it met the wet flesh of his throat. Others say he was already dead, and the act was one of symbolism rather than cruelty. But does it matter? In either way, the message was the same. Crassus had turned greed into a religion, and now that God demanded blood. As the metal poured in his jaw cracked, his skin blistered and burst. Those close enough to hear swore they'd never forget the sound, a gurgling rasp, a hiss of boiling breath, and then silence. His body, now more monument than man, was paraded through Parthia. Some say they decapitated him afterward and used the head as a prop in a play, a satire mocking Roman ambition. Others claim it was sent east as a trophy to rival kings. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: there was no honor in his death. No funeral, no rites, no procession through Rome's sacred streets. His corpse was never returned. His ashes never scattered by kin. He vanished into the sands of Mesopotamia, unburied, unmourned by the empire he once tried to buy. Back in Rome, the reaction was seismic. News traveled slowly, but when it came, it struck like a thunderclap. The Senate reeled in horror. Crassus's enemies, and there were many, whispered that this was justice, but even they couldn't ignore what had just happened. Rome, the eternal conqueror, had been shamed. Crassus's army, nearly 40,000 strong, had been butchered, captured, or lost. Thousands of survivors were marched east to serve as slaves and forced settlers in Parthian cities. They became ghost legions, forgotten by their homeland, absorbed into a culture they had once come to destroy. Some historians believe traces of these soldiers may have even reached as far as modern China, a tragic accidental diaspora. And what of his family? His wife, Tertulla, never spoke publicly of his death. His surviving son became politically insignificant, living in the long shadows of both disgrace and Caesar's rising star. But it was Caesar himself, Crassus's former ally, who perhaps suffered most. The first triumvirate, once a tightrope of power shared between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, was shattered. With Crassus dead, the fragile balance tilted. Pompey and Caesar would no longer be bound by rivalry, only by war. Within a decade, the Republic would burn in civil conflict. Caesar would cross the Rubicon, and Rome would never be the same. Crassus's death didn't just end a life, it ended an era. But there's something more human here, something deeper than power plays and politics. Crassus, for all his cunning, for all his cruelty, died not as a villain, but as a warning. A man who had everything, but couldn't stop. A man who couldn't bear to be second, who bought influence, armies, even history itself, but could not buy wisdom. When he stood on that plain in Mesopotamia, looking out over the vast emptiness before the battle, he still believed he could win. Still believed that Rome's will, his will, was enough to shape the world. But history doesn't bend for pride, it breaks it. And in the end, the fire he had used to burn others' homes, reputations, cities, came for him in the purest form possible, molten, gleaming, absolute, gold. So when we talk about power, when we speak the names of the great Roman titans, Caesar, Pompey, Augustus, let's remember the man who stood beside them, and who fell harder than any of them. Crassus died alone, in pain, in the middle of nowhere, not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but on his knees, his mouth full of the very thing he chased, and silence, thick, burning silence where ambition used to live. Marcus Licinius Crassus died without a grave, but his death left an imprint deeper than any stone monument. In some ways, his body disappeared, but in others, he never truly vanished. The molten gold poured into his throat became a symbol across empires. To the Parthians, it was a triumph. To the Romans, a nightmare. No statue was raised in his name. No triumphal arch bore his victories. In the public records of Rome, his name began to fade, scrubbed gently but deliberately by history's quieter hands. Even Cicero, a man who once sat with Crassus in the Senate, debated him in courts, perhaps even feared him, would later mention him, not with reverence, but with a kind of resigned irony. The richest man in Rome, undone by the very thing he worshipped. There were no songs, no epic elegies, just a whispered caution among the elite: don't chase what Crassus chased. His family faded into political obscurity. His descendants bore the weight of his infamy more than his wealth. The estates he left behind were vast, but tainted no longer emblems of triumph, but reminders of arrogance. And yet the effects of his fall stretched far beyond his lineage. Crassus's death shattered the delicate scaffolding holding Rome's republic together. With him gone, Caesar and Pompey had no buffer, no third voice to stabilize the wheel. The collapse came quickly. Civil war erupted. Friend turned against friend. Pompey was beheaded in Egypt. Caesar was stabbed to death on the Ides of March. In time, the Republic became an empire ruled not by law, but by emperors with armies at their backs. And in this brutal transition, this long, bloody unraveling, Crassus's ghost lingered. His defeat at Carrhae remained a stain on Roman pride for centuries. No general could forget it. No campaign in the East could ignore it. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, would later try to recover the lost standards taken by the Parthians in that battle, not just for military pride, but to erase the shame of Crassus. It took diplomacy, not war, to get them back. Even then, Rome never truly avenged him. In the East, the tale of the man who died by drinking gold became legend, a parable, a dark lesson passed from court to court, from father to son, that greed leads to ruin and arrogance to fire. Even today, echoes of his death remain, in literature, in cinema, in our metaphors. Pouring gold down one's throat, it still exists, still chills, still reminds us that wealth, when idolized, becomes poison. But maybe the tragedy of Crassus isn't just the horror of his death. Maybe it's what it says about us, about the human condition. That a man could rise so high, possess so much, and yet be consumed by the need for more. That a brilliant mind, one capable of surviving civil war, financing empires, shaping history itself, could still fall victim to something so simple, so ancient: hunger. He wasn't born a monster. He was made by a world that rewarded ruthlessness, that taught him to see people as assets, cities as chess pieces, gold as salvation. And in the end, he believed it, until the gold killed him. There is no grand epilogue, no redemption arc, just the dust of a man who reached too far, wanted too much, and paid the price history never forgets. So the next time we marvel at fortunes amassed at billionaires and empires built on coin and conquest, think of Crassus, the man who learned too late that some hungers can't be fed, and that in the end, the mouth that devours gold burns from the inside out. So now you know, the richest man in Rome didn't die in battle. He didn't die in bed. He died choking on molten gold, a cruel, perfect punishment for a man who thought wealth could make him untouchable. But Crassus's story is just one thread in Rome's blood-soaked tapestry. If you think this death was brutal, wait until you meet the emperor who bathed in his enemy's blood, or the woman who poisoned her own children to hold on to power. History hides monsters in silk robes and marble halls. And their stories aren't just chilling, they're warnings. Warnings about power pride and the price of wanting too much. So if you're ready to uncover the next forgotten tragedy, one even darker, even more twisted, click here. And don't forget to subscribe, because the past isn't dead. It's just waiting to be unearthed.